done.
Good evening. Welcome to Christ Church Cathedral. I'm Jonathan Thomas and I serve as dean here. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the ancestral home of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I would be remiss recognizing the home of those peoples at the beginning of a lecture on homelessness without saying some word about the fact that on the land of their traditional home, our First Nation neighbors suffer from a rate of homelessness grossly disproportionate to their population numbers. Some of that has to do with the sense of home that is defined by ownership and not belonging, by individual property rather than communal well-being. And that has robbed our Indigenous neighbors of not only houses, but a sense of home and connection to place. I was recently hiking on our west coast in the Chalmouth territory, the land of the Tloquiat people. I came across a sign describing the native flora and fauna in the area and saying that many of their indigenous words for those species were lost in the era of the Anglican residential school. But, it said, that if they've returned to the land and learned to live in harmony with the land there, the words would come back to them because it was the indigenous language of creation there. That is a dream worth dreaming together to make a common home. May we learn to speak the language of the land here, a flowering camas and shimmering arbutus, playful otter and fearful storms, that we may live in harmony with creation and the ancient peoples of this land, and build a shared home for us together. Thank you for joining us tonight for this year's John Albert Hall Lecture. The lecture series was endowed for the purpose of teaching faithful Christians about how our theology interacts with science and contemporary thought, so that our voice could be represented in important civic and cultural conversations of the day. Today, in Victoria, one of those conversations is about homelessness. And so that was chosen as the topic of this year's lecture and the conference over the next 2 days. It's my honor tonight to welcome Dr. Siobhan Garrigan to give the lecture on a theology of home in a time of homelessness. Professor Garrigan has taught for the last dozen years at Trinity College, Dublin, after terms at the University of Exeter and Yale University. She serves as the Loyola Chair of Theology and the head of School for Religion, Peace Studies, and Theology. Her work is mostly at the intersection of social justice and theology, particularly through the lens of sacramental theology. And she has written on poverty, ecumenism, peace processes, gender, and racial discrimination. Before her academic career, she spent a number of years working with the unhoused population in New York City, before moving to England to become the founding director of the Emmaus community of Coventry. The Emmaus community is an intentional community of formerly homeless people learning skills, living, and working together. Garrigan feels that the community dealt with the fundamental need for work and the fundamental need for company that almost all homeless people feel. Today, there are over 20 iterations of that Emmaus community across England. Her work is not just academic, it is grounded in practice and lived experience. To do this lecture, Siobhan came to Victoria days early so that she could familiarize herself with the situation in this city, get tours of some local social service agencies, and meet some of the area's executive directors, so that her words might connect to us here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Siobhan Garrigan to the lectern.
Good evening. Thank you to each and every one of you for coming out and for your presence here this evening. A particular thanks to the Dean, Jonathan Thomas, for that lovely introduction, for the invitation, for your kind hospitality, and for introducing me to people working with those experiencing homelessness in this region. And I too honour the Indigenous people of this region, acutely aware that it is in their ancestral home that we are about to discuss the idea of home. We'll do our best. What is homelessness? Well, often we have the image that you see here of a lone, rough-sleeping male who is assumed to be drug and or alcohol addicted. And that is a very real reality. But it's also what is not quite correctly called hidden homelessness. This disproportionately affects women and children, not that they cannot be rough sleepers. Of course, they too sometimes have to do that. But it is so unsafe that more often they are couch surfing, staying in people's houses temporarily, sleeping in their cars, going from pillar to post, being housed in B&Bs. Aha. Do I need to begin again? Yeah? Okay. We'll start at the very beginning. It's, as you know, thank you to each and every one of you for coming here this evening. To Jonathan for his kind hospitality, and to the people who I've met in this region. And I honour the Indigenous people whose ancestral home is the site in which we are discussing the idea of home. So, homelessness. The stereotype is of a lone male, probably drug-addicted, street-sleeping person. And people do live in these conditions, of course. I've seen them in this city. But it's also women and children, sometimes street sleeping, but much more often so-called hidden away. It's couples and families, it's people housed in a single room in a hotel or a B&B, people couch surfing, people sleeping in their cars, people going from pillar to post, one family or friend to another without an end. People who do have addiction issues, people who don't necessarily. It is displaced people. It is increasingly refugees, and with the climate crisis, we're going to see many, many millions more people displaced through the climate catastrophe. But it's also what is sometimes called simply the condition of modernity. The idea is not just, as we'll discuss in a minute, that homelessness is baked into the capitalist formula. It's also the ways in which modern life in the last several hundred years have been characterized by a pervasive sense of unbelonging. The things that people used to be bound by or used to find their belonging through have increasingly disappeared, and people are atomized and meant to be successful as individuals and not as by virtue of their belonging to a collective. And so when theology to date has addressed these various forms of homelessness, it has tended to take 4 routes to the topic. The first refers to religious values, ethics, we might call it, theological ethics, in order to exhort social change. So in the hope that people will be given the grounding, the principles, an argument to do work on behalf of people experiencing homelessness. Catholic social teaching is probably where we find most material on that, but it's not exclusively there. The second approach takes Bible stories about homemaking and home wrecking and weaves a tapestry of biblical inspirations to help people interpret homelessness and interpret their ministry among people experiencing homelessness. The third mines stories of people experiencing homelessness in order to hold up those stories and to claim those stories as theological because of the premise that if God is among those who are poor and suffering, then we should listen to those who are poor and suffering to understand God's revelation in the world. And the fourth is more anthropological and studies how people and groups respond to homelessness. And studies, there are a couple of studies mentioned in the small print there. Can you read the small print? Yeah, okay. Those studies are big collections of from people like the people who I have met in the last day or two, who are working with people who are experiencing homelessness and or people in addiction. And they have a faith basis for their work, which may be historical, it may be deeply personal, it may be both. And this third set of studies shows how, from different faiths, we can learn from one another, especially to avoid burnout, especially to have a feeling of solidarity that can maybe help counter the loneliness that often comes with this sort of work that people working at the coalface experience. However, I'm not going to do any of those four approaches. They're all good, they're all valid, they're all really helpful. But what I'm interested in is when people talk about homelessness theologically, as the previous four approaches do, there's an assumption about what home is. So if we talk about homelessness, we might benefit from getting clearer about what the lessness is of. What do we mean when we think about home? If we turn to the Bible and look up on Google or ChatGPT or whatever we use nowadays, home, there are lots of references, but actually it can be quite confusing because it's a word that's used to translate lots of different words, very few of which mean what we mean when we talk about home. So a household in the ancient Near East was not like a home today in the way that we think about it. Another common way of looking to the Bible to treat the idea of home is to claim that Jesus taught that we ought to be homeless, that he said foxes have their holes, the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Humanity has nowhere to lie down. Go and do likewise, leave your father, leave your mother, leave your brothers, follow me. But Jesus also really counted on particular homes. Peter's mother-in-law, many people in Bethany, Martha and Mary, and he sent his beloved disciple, his beloved friend, to take Mary from the foot of the cross, to make her home with him, one of his final tasks was to home his mother with his friend. So it wasn't the case that Jesus was homeless in the sense that we think of it. So it's confusing to go to the Bible, and then it gets even more confusing when we go to the early church. A mistake, I think, came in quite early into Christian thinking about home. The mistake was, well, the mistake derived, like many mistakes do, from a not bad thing, or even from a good thing. So there's an idea that we were at home with God before we were born. There's a strong idea that we will be at home with God when we die. And in Ireland, that's still part of the funeral rite, the idea that you go home to God when you die. That language is in the funeral rite. The difficulty with this quickly emerged that people described this life as exile. We see this in the early 2nd century, in the letter to Diogenes. We see it in the early Middle Ages with the creation of the Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, which describes this life as an exile and prays for it to be over. And then moving into modernity, we have it in many hymns, the idea that we will be one with God after we're dead, and that we would like God's help, as of ages past, now to survive this horrible portion where we are just left in the middle between two entrance and exit points. And I see this as a gap. Now becomes a gap, the gap of the now. And that phrase helps us understand the problem with where the Christian idea in the West of home went wrong. Because if you're in a gap, especially an exiled gap, but if you're in any sort of gap, what do you feel? You feel a sense of suspension between two things. You feel things not really being real. You feel incomplete. You might feel frustration. Usually you feel longing, a longing to be at rest, to be at home, to arrive, to not be in exile anymore, because separation is painful, really, really painful. And I think Christianity, for a long time, has lived with a tacit understanding of not belonging in God, and has not fully recognized the pain of that. To not belong is incredibly painful. And so, if you have profound feelings of separation and the pain of that, but you're not really noticing the pain of that, it's probably because you're putting that somewhere else. And over the centuries, Christians have tried to find ways of belonging to fill that gap. We've had an accumulation of capital, which is not just a new thing. Think of indulgences right through the Middle Ages in the Roman Church, trying to secure enough money in the bank on your soul to make sure that you belonged and that you were secure with God for eternity. We've had, through the Reformation, a respectability signalling. So my status, what do you say in Canada? Status, okay, my status, is a way of belonging. It signals my belonging. This is part of the origins of over-individualism, because it's mine, all mine. We've had the whole colonial horror show with entitlement for people who are superior, who are Christian, who therefore have a right to settle, to think that they are the ones who educate, because that too affords a sense of belonging. Entitlement and belonging, entitlement is a perverse form of belonging, but it passes as belonging. We've had possession. If any of you know the work of Willie James Jennings, his fantastic basic insight that if you separate people from their land, all that you are left with is racialization, because that's how people will then find their belonging or their identity, or more to the point, how others will tell them they ought to belong or don't belong. Belonging also became the rule of patriarchy, whether it was making God an overly masculine authority figure, or whether it was giving a domineering dad at the dinner table authority in this world, or you can think of many more examples. Because it gave people a sense of structure and the way that we ought to live, and if you live this way, you will be living in an ordered way, and order is another perverse form of belonging. And finally, belonging became alignment with national interests. The nation became home, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. In fact, it looks like I'm going to say more about that right now. Okay. So, Christianity, because of this gap, the gap of the now, forms people who are extraordinarily susceptible to two forces. The first is nationalism, and the second is capitalism, consumer capitalism. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about nationalism and capitalism. The idea emerged hand in hand with the period immediately after the Reformation, although it grew enormously through the processes of colonization, that the nation being your home is just the way it's meant to be. It became a false orthodoxy. It's what, again, Willie James Jennings has called a distorted doctrine of creation. So it's not that this was an optional model for organizing society. It was an idea that was presented as if it were God's will. God ordered the world according to nations, and therefore you ought to align with them. Nations became sacralized in this process. And the horror of that comes when we think about the way in which the nation is designed to say who does not belong. So we're seeing a huge resurgence of this in Ireland at the moment, where nationalism in one form was very important for getting our independence from our own colonial history just 100 years ago, and 4 to be precise. But the rise of a form of nationalism which is about people who would like to come to our country being told that they cannot because they are not part of our national identity. They have their own national identity and they should stay there, is causing extraordinary strife. And yes, there are echoes of North American, especially over there, the build the wall, all that stuff. But I don't think there's a Western country at the moment, tell me if I'm wrong about yourselves, I doubt it, that isn't facing something similar. We're in a real moment of a nasty form of nationalism, which is not new. It's about keeping people away with a divine legitimation for that. Capitalism. The gap of the now is really painful. And so when you're feeling unsettled, there's this instinct that if you could have something, the unsettledness would become more settled. This is the foundation on which consumer capitalism relies, that it is a salve to something unsettled in the soul, and that you gain your belonging by getting a particular thing, by possessing particular things. They can be yours, yay! You thought they were just for other people. No, they can be yours, or some things can't. But maybe if you work hard enough, they could be. It's all a myth, and it produces a false filling of the gap, and it produces a false Christianity. Religion itself becomes something to be possessed. It becomes something to have as a badge. It becomes something that's marketable and that is consumable. And that's a long way from bearing prophetic witness, so giving your life to service, all the things that we're going to talk about in a minute. The trouble with capitalism, as if what I've said isn't trouble enough, is that it entrenches inequality. So this is a bit like how nationalism entrenches an other. Capitalism entrenches inequality because it's a myth that everybody can have anything like the same. And it results in huge wealth inequality, and that has all sorts of problems about how we perceive human dignity, because if we're taking our cues from a market, and if religion is marketized, then there's nothing to stop us thinking of people in terms of an order of worth, an order of value, that some people just don't have the same productivity, therefore don't have the same value. It's also very dangerous if you're living in a democracy, because a democracy is predicated on an informed electorate and on equality, and everyone having an equal access to information and everyone having an equal vote. And once equality goes, democracy goes. It also, very important for the era we're living in, prevents democratic responses to the climate catastrophe. So it's not an accident that it's eroding democracy, because if democracy is intact, democracies can get together and come up with climate treaties. So, Christians don't need a better distribution of the alleged goods of capitalism, nor stronger national borders, nor a nuclear family in a nice house with a nice car, nor more militaristic masculinity. What they do need is to feel that we are actively participating in a life that supplies an adequate sense of belonging in the now. So I'm going back. If it was the gap of the now that made us susceptible to nationalism and capitalism, then we need to go back to the now, the gap. We need to go back to the gap of the now and say, what would help us not be susceptible to nationalism and capitalism? What would be another way through this? What would generate the assurance, security, confidence, and peace of a real home? Now, And in the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to ask you to consider that what would do that is an idea that we're not in exile, but that we are participating in the life of God here and now. And in what remains of the lecture, I am going to invite you to look with me at the idea that participating in the life of God is home. That's a vision, a theological vision of home, which I think has the potential to alter how we see homelessness. In the remainder of my speaking time, there'll be time for questions later. I'm going to look at participation in the life of God in 3 different ways, each of which has a root in the Bible, not through the etymology of the word home or in teaching about homes, but in teachings about participating in the life of God. And through that route, looking at how to participate in the life of God, I think we can come to a Christian theology of what it is when we talk about home. Are you with me so far? Yes? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Discipleship as home. Early Christians were called to follow Jesus, not because he was cool, but he was, I guess, but because to follow Jesus is to participate in the life of God. He said, "Come follow me," and it is not easy. It requires letting go of your possessions. Or more specifically, just possession as a concept. And what this means is discipleship replaces possession in the Gospels. I've already said housing was vital to Jesus' ministry. But homes as possessions, as things that hold us back, that's what we are called in Jesus' teaching to let go of. Homes as part of the circuitry, in fact, as facilitators of the circuitry of discipleship, were essential. People needed to sleep, people needed to eat, people needed to have sites in which sick people could be brought for healing. These are not random locations. They're important grounds for the circuitry of discipleship. The earliest Christians, as you may know, were called those of the way. And the way is a very important biblical concept to help us understand what discipleship is. Discipleship isn't a list of tasks that are the same for everybody. It's a way. And the earliest disciples were called those of the way. They were only called Christianoi a fair bit later. Jesus himself said, "I am the way." And that's where the name for the early followers of Jesus derived from. Jesus is the way. His disciples were those on the way. To follow the way, says Sean Copeland, requires that Jesus' disciples take up a new and different way of being in and for the world. So it's not an optional, I'll do this on Monday and I'm grand the rest of the time. It's a holistic way of living, way of life. And it involves following a person. It's relational. It's our relationship. Again, not a list of tasks. As we know, the injunction is to take up one's cross and follow the way. And there's no denying that it is a tough way. You have to die to a way of life which a culture would much prefer that you pursued. You have to die to it and set yourself on the way that Jesus indicated and was, not just indicated, but was. It's relational. Follow Jesus on the way. And it sounds horrible. Everything I've just said sounds, pretty tricky and lonely. But we know also from the Bible, from Acts, that the testimony of those who were those of the way was that they felt enormous joy and pleasure and satisfaction. So we're encouraged that this is tough. It's the way of the cross, but it is fulfilling, and it needs to be done in community of some sort. But when it is, it's we get to feel like the people in Acts. In my experience, not every day, but sometimes. And there's a theme here because it is in eschewing possession that one takes up the way. I hope this is the next slide. Nope, it's not. So I think it's Luke 14:33 is a very important text because it's the story of it's the story where Jesus says to the rich young man, "You must give up all your possessions, give the money to the poor, and come and follow me." And the disciples say, "Oh, really?" And and Jesus says, "Yeah, really." That's a paraphrase, but it's not inaccurate. So, being of the way, then, if you are divesting yourself of possession as a way of life, you think, well, what do I? We know. I'm not going to go through them, but there are specific things that we do to be followers, to be on the way. Can everyone read them? Can you read them at the back? Yeah? Okay, in that case, I won't read them out. So, if this is part of finding home, then we're talking about these activities as a mode of dwelling. And we have to remember that dwelling is wrought. It can't be bought. It's a way of living. Second, companionship as a second biblical model for how we can participate in the life of God. God, at so many different points in the Bible, we read God's express desire to dwell among God's people. We read it all through the Hebrew Bible. We read it right at the very end of Revelation, at the end of the Bible. And that is as an ongoing presence in creation, in Christ, in the Spirit, not just before birth, not just after death, but accompanying us now. It was God's dearest wish to not abandon us, but to live, to dwell with us and among us. And we meet this God in those with whom we live and in the natural world, and with all the relationality in which God is God's self dwelling and present, potentially present to us in the world. In particular, we're told that we must love the stranger. We must accompany the stranger. Now, the Hebrew Bible, as you know, was written in a time and place of displacement. And many of the injunctions in the Hebrew Bible to love the stranger, the widow, the orphan in your midst come from the experience of displacement, which seems particularly relevant in a time of mass migration, and with mass migration on the horizon. So, for example, Deuteronomy 10:19, you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers. I know from our recent experience in Ireland, the idea that we emigrated around the world because things were very difficult at home, and therefore we should welcome new people now that we are a more prosperous nation. It's a hard argument. It's a really, really hard argument because of the things we discussed a bit earlier. People have so categorized other people as other or of lesser value that people give themselves a pass on the idea that these people are actually just like we were or in a worse state than we were. But the Bible goes on. The Hebrew word for stranger is ger, but it can also be nochri or zer. And these other words actually connote enemy. Now, we don't hear in the Hebrew Bible, love your enemy, like we hear it very clearly in the New Testament. But it's complex. It's saying you have to love people who are strangers and who appear as enemies, we might say, other. So, learning from Will Gaffney, she asked, what is the difference between being a sojourning stranger, someone who's displaced and just living among you, and being an enemy stranger? How do you bridge that gap so that you don't, as we in the modern world are doing, give yourself a pass? And she, through her studies, concluded that it's through relationship, it's through actually encountering, accompanying, dealing with, living with one another that even the enemy sort of stranger can be made the sort of stranger who it's thought to be easier and proper to love. And she talks about examples of this, which you can see on the board. Sorry, I'm going too fast. But the point is that you can't, in this approach, set out to love a group of people, a them. You have to find a way of relating one by one, each to another. If you set out to think of that group over there, you're not going to break down. She says, the testimony of the Hebrew Bible would lead us. This is the trick, the clue, the unlocking key that says, this is how you do it. You do it person to person and not by thinking group to group or they're a part of that group. No, just relate to them. And she gives examples of really quite extraordinary relationships that are buried to our eyes often, well, they were to mine before I read her book, in the Hebrew Bible of like an Amalekite, the most despised group, most despised, absolutely kept out, so many wars to make sure we never have anything to do with them. But the one-by-one relationship was such that it ended up with an Amalekite serving in the Israelite army at the time of David, being beloved, belonging, being part of their group. So, Christians have this central biblical injunction made very explicit to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And I don't think I'm the only one in the room who has experienced that as very, very difficult to do. In our contexts, it might show up differently. So in my context, nationalism often takes the form of sectarianism. There's a long history of Catholic Protestant animosity, famously. But in your context, there's still nationalism, even though it doesn't take the same form that it takes in my context. And so how do we get around this? Not just for the other group, the invading group, the displaced group who we don't want, the people on the streets who some people just don't want to see. They see them as a group, as if they were an ethnicity. Well, we need a skill set. This is what Gaffney was pointing to. And she said about, it happens one relationship at a time. Those relationships will have been formed through specific activities precisely to overcome the inherent difficulty within them. What might be a skill set for loving, for accompanying one another when it's really difficult to do that? Well, I have 3 quotations which I find helpful. The first I've already talked a bit about. Gaffney says, undertake one relationship at a time. Takes away the group. Another second skill I learnt from the Northern Irish poet Gail McConnell, who sadly, her father was killed by the IRA. He was a prison officer. In front of her, on her driveway, he was shot when she was 3 years old, and seeing him off to work in the morning. And her poetry has explored how to grow up trying to obey the injunction to love your enemies when you are culturally encouraged to just love your own people, and your enemies are just somewhere over there. But you definitely, have a pass from loving them because of all the horrible things they've done to you. And she couldn't accept that. And so what she says is taken from her mum, who said, think and imagine about this event from, as it were, the other side, or from the perspective of those who had chosen to do it. And the event that her mum was talking about was her dad's murder. But Gail says that this line helps her with even an ordinary event, like in a coffee shop or in a road rage situation, that to think about things from the other side interrupts the idea that you get a pass from having to love this other person. And the third, and for me, it's been the most helpful in my own life, is from the British theologian Alistair McFadden, who is a police officer. And he has a great article about how in policing, what does loving your enemies look like? And he talks about only using sufficient restraint when apprehending somebody. So it would be so easy to bruise someone or to hurt someone, and you might feel they deserve it. But to just treat them up to the point of necessary force or containment. And he, in that same article, says how he came to see through this process of saying, well, what does it mean to be Christian as a policeman? How do you love these people who are doing horrible things in your community? That the biggest barrier is to loving your enemies is to not thinking that you have enemies, is not thinking that you have enemies. And so you have to admit you have enemies in order to love them. And so for him, naming the people he was chasing and arresting as enemies was the key to figuring out how to love them. And finally, from my own experience, as Jonathan mentioned, starting the second Emmaus community in the UK and running it. As you know, the story of Jesus on the road to Emmaus is one in which Jesus becomes known in the breaking of the bread. But before that, there was a big old long walk in which the disciples, bereft, were talking to a stranger and inviting that stranger to eat with them. And they are called companions. And the Emmaus movement started in Paris in the aftermath of the Second World War, when, as you might know, there was massive refugee displacement all through continental Europe, and a lot of people coming to Paris. And of course, there was the Algerian problem, and huge numbers of unhoused people in the city. And a French priest who went on to be a politician and sadly has since been discredited, rightly, for his sexual predating of people in his community. But he opened up the presbytery to anyone, and he opened up the gardens for camping, and he opened up any building the church owned, and started the Emmaus community. And after 1 year, they kept the name Emmaus, but they said, we'll no longer be a Christian organisation, because so many of the people who were coming were Muslim. But it will just be the name that signifies this. But the thing I'm getting to with this story is that from the very first day, the people who came called one another companions from the story of the road to Emmaus. And so 50, 60, 70 years later, I'm a theologian, not a mathematician, in Coventry, we adopted this practice of calling one another companions, and it was hugely helpful because it took away the idea that people were guests. They were living there, it's their home. It took away the idea that people were service users. It wasn't a service provider, it was an intentional community. But it also took away the idea that they had to be my friends, because I couldn't stand lots of them. And it helped me remember that my job was to accompany and to be accompanied. It's mutual. And in that mutual accompanying, we participate in the life of God. As the pre-Pentecost, what word am I looking for? Before they realized that they were the resurrected, that's the word, before the companions on the road to, before the disciples on the road to Emmaus recognized this is the risen Christ, what they were to him and what he was to them was a companion. So they were participating in the divine life, the life of the resurrected Christ, through their mutual companionship. And thirdly, sacramentality. Sacramentality used to be thought of as, theologically, as a distinctly Catholic thing, Roman and Anglican. And a lot of other Christian denominations were squeamish about sacramentality, or outright did not use that concept for very good historical, doctrinal reasons in their own traditions. But in the last 30, 40 years, that's changed quite a lot, because our understanding of what a symbol is changing through linguistic philosophy. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with linguistic philosophy tonight, maybe another time. And what we have now is a move from the idea, or a reconnection really, of the idea that sacramentality is to be found in the sacraments, to the idea that the whole of the created order is sacramental. That is, the whole of the sacrament of the created order, everything being created by God, can be to us a sign, a prompt to relationship with the divine in the world now, in our lives. Just a few things, if theology is your thing, which it might be, coming to a lecture like this, but it might not be, so I'm going to go through these quite quickly. That's the compromise. So for those who... Sally McFaig has this wonderful phrase that the universe is God's body. Many Orthodox theologians have never moved away from the idea that creation itself is a sacrament. So Chris Avagis is, you may know, a recent example but of an Orthodox theologian, but it's never not been thought of like that in Orthodoxy. Hospitality. There's a lovely book on hospitality as sacramental. There's a lovely book on preaching as sacramental by an evangelical Protestant. There's a lovely book chapter on classroom education as sacramental by a womanist theologian. And there's an amazing book, or two now, on contemporary worship music as sacramental, so that's moved a long way from the narrow Catholic understanding of it. Okay, that's the survey over. So what is it if we think of sacramentality more broadly? How God's presence is made sensible in the world. I love that quotation. Young scholar, one of the contemporary Christian music scholars. From a different vein, you may know Leonardo Boff's work. So this is from much, much longer ago, this second quotation. I don't know if you ever read, he had that little book, The Sacraments of Life, and he tells the story of, he was studying in Tübingen or Heidelberg or one of those big posh German places, and a long, long way from Latin America where he grew up. And sadly, while he was away, his father died. And he couldn't get home for the funeral. It happened too fast, and he wouldn't have had the money. Just wasn't possible. So his mum sent him the enamel cup that the family used to take water and to share it, and the last butt of the cigarette that his dad had smoked before he died. And he felt that these were sacraments of life. So where the transcendent breaks through into the immanent, big language, but that's the story he's talking about. And Liebenberger, Flemish theologian, says, this is the paradox of Christian revelation. The God who never can be contained by the historical and material, nevertheless only reveals God's self in the concrete here and now. It's a great summing up, really, of the paradox. But how does sacramentality help us understand home? Well, it is the most obvious No. It's the most accessible or immediately accessible salve to the anxiety of that gap of the now, because we can at any point look around us, smell, hear, taste, touch, sixth sense. Have I missed one? See something, and tune in to the moment that is not before we were meant to be, holy, and it's not coming in the future. It's now that our senses are allowing us in a moment to sense divine life. And by sensing it, we have already participated in it. We don't need to try more than that. Secondly, it avoids the idea that one's individual body is one's home, without denying the significance of the body or whatever state it might be in, because it is through your body, whatever state it is in, that you encounter the sacramental. It acknowledges that worship or liturgy is a distinct route to understanding oneself and to be at home in the world. And so if you have the opportunity to be part of a community whose worship life is nourishing for you, and not everybody does, I know, then that is a very obvious, that's the right word in this place, to go and learn how sacramentality can ground us in this moment by allowing a participation in the life of God, in the life of worship, is part of the life of God. And finally, sacramentality reminds us of God's real presence and our ability to participate in it and draw sustenance from it. And if we feel that knowledge, or that's the wrong word, that sensibility that we are participating in what God has wanted and made and continues to sustain, then we no longer have all that abandonment and separation and anxiety going on. And so we're not susceptible to having to possess something, get something new, find something, align ourselves with a group in order to calm the anxiety or feel a sense of belonging. We've got it just from the sacramentality of life. And so, to come towards a conclusion, don't be fooled, it's not actually the last slide. Just save yourself for another minute. Home is not something that one possesses, like property in capitalism, nor aligns to, like the state in nationalism, but it's a participatory way of life by being on a way, by accompanying, and by sensing the divine. And maybe by other ways as well. They're just the three I was able to discern in my own studies. If you know of others, please tell me afterwards. And so a final thought is, might it be helpful to think of home as a verb, to take away the static nature which is associated with it, to remember that it is essentially relational, and it's the relationality that makes it open and porous rather than closed and fixed and bounded. I think sometimes that it is helpful Of course, to say to home in our language doesn't really work, or, you don't want to think of homing pigeons. That's a bit like mastery of nature. It's the wrong vibe for this theology altogether. But maybe just by keep focusing on the verbs that are associated with the three dispositions, the three disciplines I've talked about, of following, of accompanying, and of meeting, or meeting God by attuning to the world in which we live here and now. We gain a sense of the active nature of this participation. It brings it alive a little bit, especially if we can also remember that it's following, not possessing, and if it's accompanying, not othering, and if it's meeting and not longing for the divine. And I find this helpful myself because when I find myself longing, I can think back and think, okay, so the antidote is meeting. What could I do that would take this longing and seek out meeting? What could I do when I find myself othering, which I do a lot? I grew up trained to other. I can accompany and seek mutual accompanying. What can I do when I want to possess? And it's not just possessing cars or houses or big material goods. It's also possessing titles and status and all manner of props which are selves to that same anxiety of the gap, of the now. They all come from that same place, I think. And remembering the list of techniques of following can pull you back and say, this following thing that I'm doing is participating in the life of God. And over time, that becomes enough. And in time, maybe we'll all feel like the people at the end of Acts who are having a great time. There we are.
Thank you, Professor Garrigan, for both a brilliant and relatable lecture. For the purposes of this conference, I have called this a framing lecture, or rather a reframing lecture, because I think your work helpfully reorients the way we think about some of these issues that make a real difference to potential outcomes. And I'm going to use my response time to highlight a couple of those as we foreshadow some of the policy discussions of tomorrow. I think the operant theology grounding the Church's response has for a while been the teachings of Catholic social ethics. And in speaking about homelessness, traditional Catholic teaching has used the doctrine of the Imago Dei as its cornerstone. While I would never seek to question the theological touchstone that every human being is made in and reflects the image of God in their very person, I'm not sure it has turned out to be the most helpful doctrine in framing this discussion. The Imago Dei is an absolutizing and idealizing way that can be detrimental to meaningful progress to some of the very people in this room. The executive directors and frontline workers we have among us, policymakers, even faithful neighbors and dutiful advocates. I think it's led to some of the burnout among service providers. The Imago Dei, in its absolutizing nature, asks everything from those called to serve the marginalized and the destitute, to the loss of their own selves. In the ethical framework popularized by Levinas, when confronted with the face of the other, a face that reflects the image of God, there is no limit to the call it places upon your person to respond. There is a clear line from there to the burnout we see. It comes from an idealized story of a mythical Eden, and seeking to attain that utopia has led to the perfect being the enemy of the good in policy decisions that has forestalled real and attainable progress. I've seen us time and again turn away from what works, seeking what would be perfect as a solution to a devastating situation and an imperfect world. And the combination of those two things, the absolute call of the image of God and the failure to find the perfect remedy, have caused many people to become too adept at parsing exactly how much of the image of God they see in a person on the street until they see them as not fully human at all, and throw up their hands in despair that there is no progress possible, and they prefer the problem to be moved out of sight if it cannot be fixed. You have responded with a theological vision not of a person, but of home. A vision of home grounded in the dual theology of incarnation and sacramentalism that has offered some particular correctives here. The story of the incarnation famously tells us that God came and dwelt among us. Literally, it says that he tabernacled among us. A fascinating image of God living among us in a movable tent for this discussion. You've introduced companionship and accompaniment as the hallmarks of home, not absolute sacrifice for the other. Based on the idea of a God who came to simply be with us in the sordidness of our real lives and redeem us through shared life in real time and space, you've suggested the creation of real community and belonging as the way of making home. We can interact just as we are with those we meet, and together we build a common home, a true communion. We make the space between us holy. The Christ embodied in you connects with the incarnate God in me, and together we participate in the life of the divine. This vision of community as mutual is itself an antidote to some of the causes of burnout. To the policy discussion, you have offered the idea that home is a thing we make together, and it must be so, because it mars the notion of communal home to have some that do not belong, that cannot participate, that are ultimately other. This is not a problem fixed by moving homeless people, but only by creating shared visions of mutual flourishing. And in the sacramentality point, you have centered this conversation not on restoring an idyllic Eden, but on the hard and messy work of recreation, resurrection, and redemption. That work is ongoing and incremental. It is about recognizing this person as embodying the divine and thus holy and a conduit to encountering God, or making this interaction one of eternal significance and therefore sacred. And through that work, continually acknowledging God active among us, living with us, and participating in the ongoing life of God. It is a vision that's totalizing, and it can end in nothing less than all people belonging, living in the room prepared for them in the here and now. And to the average follower, the faithful neighbor and diligent advocate, you have offered the way of discipleship. Not trying to hold on to hope or parsing out who is deserving, but simply following Jesus, realizing communion one relationship at a time, creating heaven on earth one room at a time, and inviting others to do the same. At the end of your book, you ask, will this magically end homelessness? And the answer is obviously no. We already know how to end homelessness. We're just not doing it. But maybe it can reorient the way we think and give us the will to create the communities, enact the policies, and live into the way that will end homelessness by realizing a home of belonging for all of us and all of our neighbors in the present life of God today. Thank you for that vision. I would now invite questions. If you would simply raise your hand, we will come around with a microphone so that we can all hear your question.
But maybe somebody in the audience later will let you know. And there's a special place called the Carnegie Library at Main and Hastings, which is very much a place of community. And I remember passing those steps many times as I brought my son to elementary school. And I was touched by the reality of that place. There's a lot of toxicity there and a lot of pain. But that somehow the people on those steps were showing the truth of community, if we could have removed the reality of what was happening there, that it was real community. And I appreciated, as I said, in your words, this reality of relationship, and I wanted to honor the truth of relationship, not just coming from one side in community, but also within community itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's interesting, isn't it, that was on the steps of a library, and a Carnegie Library, that maybe, I hope this isn't too fanciful, just the store of knowledge and the work that has gone into creating what that library holds, and the free nature of Carnegie, the idea that this is for all, just is a very special kind of place. There weren't any steps. And I wonder if there's just some wonderful symbol in the relationality between the people and between the books in that place and the minders of that place, and the exemplar of what it is to have a civic building which is open.
Well, first Kate and then me. I'll stand so you... I'm John.
Hello.
Good to meet you.
You too.
So much richness in what you had to say, and not just what you had to say, but how you said it. I think we experienced more than a little bit of accompanying and sacramentality in the way that you spoke to us. So I think I speak for all of us that we're deeply blessed. I have two kinds of musings. They're both, I think, questions. I think Kate might have answered one of the musings I had, and that was a worry that this was a talk for people who need to divest themselves from all manner of false belongings, which we all have, but we're comfortable enough to have them, if you know what I mean, right? You're asking me to give up things that I actually do have, possessions and property, etc. I wondered, as I was listening, what you would say to those who are in a far more precarious position, and so asking for further divestment from people who don't have much to begin with, including those who are homeless. And I mean, part of what I heard Kate saying is, oh, you might miss just how much richness those who are unhoused actually do have with each other. But there's still, there was a kind of worry in me about, like, if I'm acutely precarious and you're asking me to give up more, what do I do? So that was sort of a kind of visceral question, maybe an anxiety more than it is even a question. And the second one was, the whole thing hinges on recognizing that without a deeper sense of belonging, we're always going to seek false substitutes. Mm-hmm. The whole talk, every sentence of it. And that seems to make a religious vision of some kind indispensable. Not necessarily a Christian vision, although here you spoke of it. I can imagine doing a Buddhist version of that talk, or a Hindu version of that talk. But it felt to me like without some such version, we're always going to seek the substitute. Whiteness, nationalism, capitalism. Either something holy or the idol. Always. And I wonder what that implies for how we do the project and how we do the work. Is there a kind of evangelical impulse, not necessarily to Christianity, but to community through religious life? And without it, does the whole thing just kind of fall apart? So, two questions, queries, wonderings.
Thank you very, very much. So, I'll start with the second one, if I may. As this book was written in an Irish context, the book that Jonathan read and then asked me to come and speak about parts, so that's what I mean by the book. Oh, thank you. And while we're talking about the book is free. And if you would like to read it, it's very short. There may be the only two things going for it. It is free and short. But if you Google me and the title of tonight's talk, the book will come up. I didn't write it to make a penny. It's open access, so please, if you'd like to take a look, do. I wrote the book. The book took a long time to write. even though it's now very short. It's a condensed version of a much longer manuscript. And so it was written through the years in which religious belonging in Ireland went through a massive trauma because of I think out of the 2,000 and something parishes in Ireland, I think there are only 4 that don't have a child sex abuse case of some sort or another within it. And the fall away from trust in the Catholic Church in particular, but all religion per se, was dramatic and understandable. And so you're definitely picking up on something about religious belonging as a subtext here. It was very much, your question helps me sort of realize that actually this is the context in which it was written, is all about a failure of religious belonging and then what comes next. It's not necessarily that you suddenly don't believe or love all the things that you believed and loved. It's that the institution that hosted that, or was the nexus for that, is not trustworthy anymore. I would be, therefore, less optimistic that you need a organised form of religiosity, and certainly the ways in which so many of my friends have maintained and grown relationships which are not just nourishing, but which have this opportunity of a depth charge to the sacred, have grown through other things. So we have a bunch of women's friends go swimming, like you, we live right on the water, together every morning. I don't. I'm a bit of a coward, but they do, and it's a real community for them. I do play traditional Irish music, and the friends with whom I play, 15 years ago, we would have all gone to church. Now only 1 or 2 of us do. But the music we take much more seriously. It's no longer, I might come, I might not. It's a real, we do this on a Thursday night. And if someone's not there, you hound them and care for them or tell them off. It matters more. And there could be other examples. So I'm in a phase and in a culture where, and Buddhism and Hinduism are just not available in the culture in which I am. So I think you need other people, and you need the arts in the widest sense of that word, but I'm not sure you need a religion, because I think the holy is in all those other things. To your first question, I am not asking, well, first of all, it's a great question, and thank you for it. And if I were asking for people to divest of their belongings, it would be hugely problematic because of exactly the assumption that you see inherent in such an ask. What I'm asking people to do is to alter their relationship to the what's the word? It's not an ethic of possession, to the tendency to possess rather than to hold open what you have. And so I myself was only able to get a mortgage, to get a house in my late 40s. And I had very precarious housing for all of my life until then. My parents both experienced homelessness as children. I don't come from a background of secure possession, although I'm now lucky enough to be able to, because of my university salary, to get a mortgage and to finally own a house, and the not having to move all the time, not being threatened with the rent going up and having to move, not being threatened with being kicked out because the landlord wants to sell it or wants 3 families in, etc. The lack of pressure for someone who's moved, I think I moved 23 times in 30 years, is fantastic. I'm currently, but I certainly, having finally got this level of security, I'm not asking myself to divest myself of it, nor would I be asking anybody else to. But how you have a house is the question. Is it for me alone? Is it something that is an asset? Is it something that I intend to trade? No. Is it something which I hope to hold open for the other and to house whatever is needed to be housed in that place? Yes. So no, I'm not asking people to divest themselves of their possessions. I'm asking them to divest themselves of their attachment to possessing. One way I have done this recently is, and as an academic you might relate to this, although I'm not as familiar with the American scheme, but in Europe you have to write a few books, and then you have to get so many doctoral students, and then you have to get a chair, and then you have to get a really big grant from the European Research Council, and that will bring in postdocs, and it will postdocs. That would be lovely, quacky ducks. Postdoctoral students. And it gives you huge kudos because you're bringing in millions to poor state universities. So all of last year I was thinking, okay, the next thing I've got to do is to get the ERC grant, and I'm sort of chasing this. And when the book came out, I gave a talk just on one little part of it in our local parish Advent group. And I realized in talking about my own book that this is just a possession. What the hell am I doing? Going for? This is just it will give me status, it'll make lots of other people happy, I'll have millions of research money. Like, read your own book. And that's what I mean by divesting yourself of the attachment to that for me was the next thing. An unthought through thing I've got to get and have, and it will be a false reassurance of my validity in this world.
Thank you. Great talk. Edmund Burke, one of the forefathers of conservatism, talked about how owning property is what enshrines rights. And we sort of seen that come all the way around nowadays, where ownership is actually far more of a deterrent to individual rights, which is what we see on this, because part of the reason why we have such a homelessness crisis is because of real estate, and real estate has just and priced most people out. Income assistance in this province maxes out at $1,500 a month, which won't get you a one-bedroom apartment in this city. So I was just, it's interesting to hear you talk about, one, the security, your own sense of security now that you're a homeowner. Congratulations. And two, how that's just sort of contrasted with the general state of things, because what we've enshrined in consumerist capitalism is the autonomy of the individual to own, but that's very much contrasted with the notion of what you're talking about in terms of belonging, and I think that's very much the struggle for people nowadays, is to figure out what they belong to, There's a loneliness crisis that we keep hearing about, which just goes part and parcel with that. But also there's like that sense of ownership and autonomy. That's mine, stay off my lawn, and now that becomes repellent towards the necessity for community and like collective belonging. So I was wondering if you could like just comment a bit on where you're seeing belonging happen and how that might be in contrast to our own notion of individual ownership.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wish that, so there's some of you, many of you may perhaps will know, there's something called the unitary housing model, which is an economic theory that says if 25% of the housing stock in any given place is social housing and regulated at low rents by the government, built by the government, etc., it will then radically alter the market, and the market won't keep what you did with your body when you did this. The prices won't keep doing that. It will tether it, and of course it would guarantee at least 25%. So what interests me is why we don't do that. And I think, and to the second part of your question, I think it's because of a very underdeveloped notion of belonging or collective belonging. So I'm going to, go on my hamster wheel to get what I need. However, I don't know if any of you have ever lived in Germany, for example, where or Scandinavian countries, where it's completely normal to rent for the whole of your life. And both my grandparents all rented for all of their lives. It's fine if you are in, and it doesn't necessarily give a stronger sense of belonging, but it doesn't. What's difficult is if the tenancies are not sufficiently regulated, so you're getting evicted, you don't have any stability in where you're staying, and if the prices of the market are just allowed to go sky high, and it sounds like you have definitely the whistle going on. And again, the question is, on both issues, why don't we want to address that? We know, like Jonathan said, we know how to fix this. Why don't we fix it? And I think it's because of many factors, but a hinge is the idea that's what mine is mine rather than what's ours is ours. And getting to that requires looking at a deeper sense of belonging than the belonging that comes from where you live, which, as you say, doesn't necessarily give you belonging. So many people are lonely. It's incredible. There was a young person at the back with their hand up for a while. Okay, thanks. And this will be the last question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, in your slides, I saw that you mentioned that one of the things Christians don't need is a better distribution of the so-called goods of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I was a bit confused by that, and I was wondering if you could please expand on that.
Thank you. Great question. Because capitalism itself is flawed as a route to belonging. If it's belonging we're looking for, no matter how capitalism plays out, it's not going to give it to us. It's always going to be bankrupt. I can see from your question, surely, and yes, if capitalism is the game in town, then of course the profits should be more evenly spread. Yes, but I suppose where that was coming from was, this is not going to give us the sense of belonging that is at the root of the homelessness I was talking about. But I will rewrite that slide if I ever do a talk like this again, because I don't want to be heard to be saying, just let it flow with billionaires being billionaires. No, tax the hell out of them.
Dr. Garrigan, thank you for a very well thought through and provocative talk. This issue is personal to so many of us for so many different reasons. Like so many of you, I'm sure that I have someone in my family who's been in and out of homelessness over the years. And the talk about how our call is to accompany has been personally helpful to me tonight. As somebody who likes to fix things, and it's not always easy to fix every situation, is it? So, yeah, thank you for that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bishop Anna. It's an honor and a privilege to serve as the bishop of this diocese. And hospitality is indeed a sacrament. So please do join us. There's not a huge lavish feast, but there's a bit of cheese and some fruit and some water. So please, if you have want to visit with one another or have a few last questions for Dr. Garrigan before she gets a well-earned rest, please stay for a few minutes. And then please come back tomorrow morning. There'll be coffee and muffins and fruit out for you early in the morning, and then we'll begin in here at 9 o'clock, and there's a full day of panels as we continue to talk about this issue. And yeah, we know how to solve homelessness, and we're not doing it. So let's keep talking about that tomorrow. God bless, and thank you again, Dr. Garrigan.